Hi everyone, we're very proud to be here today, not only because we're making quite a lot of progress to afford a trip from Gothenburg all the way up to Oslo, but also for the fact that we are finding for the first time in quite a long time a context in which crazy people like ourselves actually could feel at home in this disruptive entrepreneurial corner of North shipping. It's a great pleasure, obviously, to have this opportunity to discuss the ways of improving this area, an area that we have struggled with, not my personally, of course, but thousands and thousands of years since sailing and seaborne trade ever started. We've been fighting this issue of fouling. And all kinds of solutions have been tested, sometimes in terms of desperation, sometimes actually quite good attempts. But the only thing we've been learning, because we're actually standing here 2,000 years later, is that everything is changing to the extent that nothing that was good yesterday will be working satisfactory tomorrow. We have to adapt to change all the time. And that's where iTech comes in. We only exist because we think that small incremental changes will not do enough. The global shipping community has a super impact on everything we do. Globalization is completely relying on shipping, so we have to make sure that chain is as efficient as ever possible. And we know that the industry is suffering changes all over the place. We have seen seawater temperatures increase, which puts pressure on the underwater coating systems. We're seeing different trade patterns, being more idling in terms of the use of the ships, trading into different waters, maybe warmer than before. We're seeing regulation. Maybe the most disruptive part of anti-fouling is the regulatory part of it. There's been so many changes, and you don't have to go back that far in time, which put everything on a different plane, so to say, right? You had super duper functioning things, and a few years later it didn't work for other reasons. And parts of this actually spells advancements of science. We are now aware of so much more than we were before. Solutions that maybe worked yesterday are now shown to have adverse effects sometimes. iTech has been developing through science. The picture behind you is something we're very proud of. The research started when the regulation really tipped things over back in the 1990s. The idea was then to come up with something that could reduce friction and then respond to the needs of reducing the fuel and emissions to air and sea. But it also had to respond to the regulatory landscape that was in front of us. And we know that only 10, 15 years ago, there was 0 endpoints to be assessed against. Almost everything passed. Of course, it had to do a good job in terms of efficacy and so on, right? And now, 10, 15 years later, we're finding ourselves in a situation where we have to respond not only to your ship owner demands of reducing fuel and the paint maker demands of having compatible and cheap products or cost-efficient products, but also to a regulatory world with more than or around 100 different endpoints to comply with. How do you do this? We took it from a scientific standpoint again, starting off with a cross-functional research team back in the University of Gothenburg that looked to the biology of the problem, the biological aspects to it, looked to the chemistry of it, looked to the physics of it, and also obviously to the industrial side of it, including the business side. What came out of that was quite surprising, and this is where a disruption was made. The researchers found, crazy enough, the mechanism of why some of the most undesired and unwelcomed creatures actually attach on a hull. The barnacles attach so hard that they normally have to be hard polished off, so to say. They have to be taken out by mechanical measures. By knowing how these creatures work and how they function, you could screen pharmacological compounds. You could screen theories that couldn't be done before to come up with a solution. The fundamental idea was, of course, come up with something that was efficacious, a lot more efficacious than something we have seen before, but still within the framework of the regulation. The idea was also to have a small amount of biocides as possible in a paint. And this compound, Selektope, responded to that. It responds to that because it's actually relying on its mode of action. And you may care less or care a lot about the destiny of a barnacle. We love barnacles, and we can probably show you barnacles in every shape and form if you want to. But the important thing is, by having this selective mode of action, we can, with very small quantities, create a change. And that's what you're seeing on this picture behind me. Only nanomolar concentrations, a few grams per liter paint, was used in that anti-fouling coating to create that static performance. And that opens up a new dimension for the paint makers and hence the ship owners. Static performance can now be treated completely different than before, or at least a new tool has been available to improve the static performance. One of the greatest challenges for the ship community today. And we're doing this because we're creating a flight mode to the barnacles. We're triggering a behavior for them to swim away. And this is where disruption comes in. So on a small scale, this is disruption. Throughout the 2000-something years, we've been working anti-fouling. It's all been focusing around lethal mode of action, toxic mode of actions. And now, for the first time ever, we are having paint makers applying a biorepellent containing anti-fouling on ship hulls. It repels the barnacles, and that opens up for other dimensions. So how does this help us move forward in this industry? Well, first of all, we're acknowledging that only through science we can meet these new demands that the surrounding environment is putting on us. We can't go on a trial and error basis anymore. We cannot even just stay still and not do anything. Things are changing. And that's why we're thinking that this is going to help the community reach its new targets of being more efficient and responding to all these changes. I-Tech is a relatively small company, showing also that a great deal of change can be done with small measures, only if you have the right attitude. So even if you have the greatest scientific discoveries alongside, you won't succeed. You also need a great deal of passion, and you need some crazy people who know how to make their haircut in the morning, and you need crazy people who are, despite 1,000 years of research and use of anti-fouling, still think there's room for improvements. And we're welcoming this nice set of panelists, the prominent panelists, to discuss this topic further. Can we use scientific measures to further disrupt things? Or how can we make this take the next step into further improvements? So by those words, Craig, I'm happy to introduce the panelists.
Question for you first, though.
Yep.
When you came up with this idea, and when you found this, and it's sort of eureka moment,
Yep.
were you looking for something specifically that did the repellent, or were you looking for something that specifically dealt with the barnacle problem?
The key thing was to deal with the public enemy number one, which was the barnacle, right? Because please remember that there's 2,000 species involved in this problem. It's not an easy task. That's probably the reason why we're still discussing this after so many years, right? And it happens then that the only way to keep concentrations low and give flexibility is by using pharmacological concepts. So that's
How did you find that? How did you find that pharmaceutical solution? At what point did you say, I'm going to choose this? I know what it is. Maybe the audience doesn't. But how did you sort of like come across that one? Because to me, when I look at what it is that you're using in the Selektope, it's not an obvious choice for me to go, oh, that equals a repellent.
Right.
The barnacle.
And it's not an obvious choice even if you know the science behind it, because as you know, it has other effects in other creatures, right? You know, it's being sedative in its mode of action in other creatures. Many great discoveries is a bit of a good luck and chance that negative control actually resulted in a completely different mode of action. In this case, a repellent mode of action. So it stimulates particles to move away from a surface containing this product. So it was a little bit of a luck, and obviously some sort of well-known matrix of compounds that could address this physiology that we knew about.
Do you want to introduce the panelists, Ryan?
Yeah, please.
Could I ask the panelists to come up now? Maritime, Wimby, naval architect and project manager at Stena, Raouf Kattan, who's managing director at Safinah, and Prof. Svensen, on the board of Safinah and also the former Maritime CEO at DNV-GL. Thank you, gentlemen. Be careful with those microphones, please. They are quite sensitive, but don't worry, they don't bite. You don't have to stand so far away from them. I'm going to go, if I can, to Raouf here, because with the Safinah, you've been looking at hull coatings and the hull issues for a number of years now. That's your specialised topic. How have you seen the evolution of hull coatings over the years? And when we're talking about the element of disruption that we were talking about, that Philip was talking about, how disruptive from you is this as a product? How new?
Thank you, Craig. You're right. Initially, the biggest disruptor was really regulatory.
You get closer to the microphone, please.
The initial disruptor was initially regulatory. That's what really changed the ball game for everybody. For many years, we settled on PET as being another solution. It provided a predictable performance, and everybody was happy. When the regulations came, everything had to change. There was no choice. What I believe was that the solution envelope would start to broaden. Would look for alternative technologies, alternative solutions to create the next generation of fouling prevention technologies. And that's what has happened. I have to say that what I had thought was by about now, the solution envelope would narrow again. We would never settle on one technology. There would be a range of technologies that would meet the needs. However, even today, I'm seeing more and more innovations coming in fouling prevention across the range, and so the envelope is sort of broadening. One of the challenges and I'm not a chemist, I'm a naval architect. I've served my time painting ships in many ways. But what I understand, one of the challenges of a new ingredient coming in is what impact does it have on the formulation envelope that the chemist can play with. And there have been products in the past that have showed a lot of promise, but narrowed the solution envelope in terms of formulation. What I understand from the chemists in Safinah is that ITEC allows a broadening of that envelope and the possible solutions. So whilst ITEC, or the Selektope product itself, is not the only ingredient we need, it needs other factors to help it perform as a total anti-fouling. It does allow the formulator to have a broader solution envelope, and that becomes an interesting option.
And I guess, yeah, this is the thing, Philip, is that it's not a coating in itself, I believe. It's an additive that goes into a coating.
When we talk disruption, this is a disruption on a lower level, right? The whole idea was here to not deviate from the coating manufacturer's original platforms, because then we would have needed another 50 years probably to get out there. The idea was to create something that's compatible, almost like a plug-in to the paint maker's broad range of systems, right? So the disruption level is on the lower tier, and thanks to the compatibility, we're standing here and seeing progress commercially being made.
But you're basically your immediate client is the hull coatings manufacturers, really, rather than the ship operators and owners. Yeah. From the ship operating owning perspective here, I've been to a lot of presentations and I've seen some of the suggestions about this hull coating, that hull coating. Can I ask you, Michael, first, how cautious were you when you heard that there's a new product on the market or being developed?
Rather cautious, actually, because we have tried quite a few different solutions through the years and through different anti-foulings. And some of them have been pretty good, some of them have been less good. So you always want to go with something that is proven. But on the other hand, unless there's a little bit of trial, there's no progress. So we thought, we started with test patches on the ships, and they proved that the product was working the way it should. And now, a year and a half back, we did a full ship, which so far has a fantastic performance. So far, a little bit of risking it and trying has worked out really well for us. But you do want to start small. Everybody wants to have full security in what they do. But the benefits, when you get it right, are really there.
When you're doing these sort of trials on behalf of a hull coating maker or a selector, have you had to go through extra hoops when it comes to regulations and port authorities and saying that we've got this product on the hull, it's a little bit different?
Yes. Regulation, as Philip said, is definitely a problem. You have to have a paint that can be, or is allowed to be used in the country, that is allowed to be used by the workers, that is allowed to be used on the hull. For test patches, we found that it's reasonably easy to get over that. And now for the full ship, it was workable as well. And it wasn't just to bring a can of paint to start painting.
Okay, what about your experiences then?
We have not gone so far as Mikael just explained. We have had a couple of test patches, and actually as we speak, we have a Suez tanker being docked this weekend, and we will see the result from that. But so I cannot really say about the result yet.
So still early days for you, but you're optimistic based on what Michael's been able to demonstrate so far. As I've always said, you know, if Coca-Cola told me to drink Coke, I'd say no, but if my mate told me to drink Coke, I'd probably have a glass of Coke. So the fact that you've got the evidence from a neighbour ship owner has probably sort of helped ease that portion, I imagine. Tom, how do you see this as a sort of environmental solution?
I think when we talk about disruptors, we tend to talk about now how to beat anti-fouling, but I think there's another disruptor in this if we look at the regulatory angle also. And that's disruptor is that you're going to, in the future maybe, in a few years' time, be denied access to a port if you have fouling on the ship. You know, we are seeing exactly the same developing as we see in the ballast water, and what's the difference? Something swimming around in the ballast water versus something that's attached to the hull that might actually spread in the local environment. And this is actually driving us in a direction where we need to solve this, and we need to find new solutions. I think there are, in a way, there are two ways. Either you deal with how and make sure it doesn't attach to the ship, or you deal with actually cleaning and keeping it off by mechanical means. That's at least what we see as the opportunities at the moment. And actually somebody suggested to me a few weeks ago, why, on some expensive ships, why don't we just build them in stainless steel and we scrub them all the time? I don't think that's a good solution. I like much more the idea of playing with the chemicals or the biochemistry and finding a way to actually prevent these things sticking. That was the original idea of silicone paints, I know. It didn't really work out, and maybe to the extent we wanted it to. But I think be aware of the regulatory, be aware that we need to find some disruptive solutions here within a time window or maybe the next 5 or 10 years and make it work. Otherwise we're going to have a bigger job at our hand. And secondly, just one more point on it, and that is, it costs us an awful lot of money to have fouling on ships. You know, you just do the sums a little bit in the head and say that if the shipping industry uses 250 million tons a year fuel, and on average, I don't think I'm exaggerating if I'm saying that on average ships lose about 10% in performance if you look roughness and fouling in combination. And then do the sums on that, and even if you cut that in half, you have $5 billion to play with. That's in a way the benefit, and also the environmental effect on this, that you are emitting less to the air. So, but there are many good arguments.
There was a vessel recently, earlier this year, that wasn't allowed into New Zealand because of the condition of its hull. It got forced to go elsewhere, and I think initially for its next port of call said, no, we don't want you either. So there really is this sort of pariah of having your hull extra dirty, covered in whatever. But that also begs another question I've got. You're talking about barnacles. There's more to hull life than barnacles here.
That's why we're not coming up with a full new solution, right? We're bringing another tool to the toolbox, which obviously paint makers are using and looking at to respond to those things that you're talking about. We discussed earlier, right? What's the driving things for the hull coatings? Invasive aquatic species is now coming up as one of the big things to avoid fouling. Hull coatings need to be more powerful, or more reliable, more consistently performing at least, than what they've been in the past, because the regulation on that side is going to increase. On top of that, you have those fuel efficiency aspects, you have the emissions to air, and you may have even emissions to sea at one point to consider. So you need to come up with solutions addressing that, and this is a part of it. For the rest of it, we have other prominent biocide suppliers, of course, and chemical binder systems and whatever else the paint maker community is using to control the soft fouling part of it.
How do you see the whole industry developing, Raouf, here as we go through? As I say, you've been watching this evolve, and you mentioned that you see the regulation as one of the key aspects here. Are we going to see stronger regulation coming in, and with that, are we going to need stronger solutions?
I think the key issue, what does the end user want out of their fouling prevention solution can be summed up in one word. They want predictability. They want to understand that if they apply any system, whatever it might be, the performance of the vessel over the life of the system is as expected. Therefore, whether it's fuel saving, fouling prevention, behaviour of the vessel to meet charter party needs, enter port and so on, is all predictable. So any developments that result in, say, formulation changes, etc., will always create a degree of instability before you reach predictability. So the industry often compares these new generation products back to TBT products, but we forget that the TBT products evolved over 20, 30 years to get stability, and these new generations of products are still in their early days. So what the industry wants is a predictable performance over a long period of time, and that's always going to be the challenge for the innovators, the developers of new technologies, and the formulators in how do we deliver that. What we have seen as a company today is that there is a much broader, as expected, a much broader level of variability in the performance of fouling prevention systems than we had 10, 15 years ago, or 20 years ago before the ban. And that is what owners are now really looking for. When we talk to them and look at how the different products that they've applied are performing, that's exactly what we're seeing, a lack of predictability in performance. And that becomes, for me, the key challenge for the industry over the next 5 to 10 years. The difficulty in trying to meet that challenge is I don't ever see the regulations stepping backwards, so I don't think the regulations will get any looser. The only thing that will happen is they will get tighter, and therefore I think you're always going to be operating in a much narrower envelope, and so the predictability of performance and the longevity of the products become critical. As has been alluded, it's not a matter of 1 month or 6 months to develop a new product. You're talking years, and if it takes, let's say today somebody has a novel idea and it's going to take 10 years to get it to market, the regulatory environment in which they're going to emerge could be very different and could actually have stopped that development well before it even gets to market. So the big challenge today is simply getting the product out there working and then be able to evaluate it over a reasonable period of time over a range of product types or vessel types to make sure you get that predictability.
And Tor, what about talking about the regulation from the class perspective as well? From dry docking to dry docking, I've often perceived that the hull coating is seen as it must have that robustness, that 5-year period in between dockings perhaps, and then there was the potential of having it extended dockings, has that put added pressure on the performance of hull coatings?
I think there's a clear wish amongst owners to extend the dry docking interval. For certain ships, there's been pressure to extend up to 7.5 years, where the regulation can allow that. And I don't think, honestly, that we have the paint solution that really works for that today. And therefore, most have actually been forced back to sort of the 5-year cycle. Some actually dock more frequently, and as a matter of habit, docks every 2.5 to 3 years also, in order to keep the performance in top shape. So I think that's the reality today. And there is certainly a potential for certain ship types to extend from a regulatory point of view. There's another element also which I think is important to add. We build ships today generally with about 20% service margin. So we install a service margin. You need some for wave, weather, wind, weather conditions that because of the added resistance. But do you need 20% for that? No, because you are anticipating to lose quite a lot of performance with fouling and hull roughness. If you can reduce that, you can actually reduce the installed power, and you're actually also reducing the ship price, and you're actually meeting easier the energy efficiency index and things like that. So there's a knock-on effect which is important. It's not just a daily fuel, it's a further knock-on effect.
But to do that, you'd have to have the robust assurance that the hull coatings would perform for that length of
Absolutely.
period.
You don't want to end up in a situation when you're underpowered and don't have enough margin and get into all kind of problems, even with your propeller and being on the wrong point of the propeller curve and things like that.
What's your experience in Stena of hull coatings? Generally, I mean, without naming names, clearly, but there must be some hull coatings you go, oh, I'm not going to touch that again.
Okay, that was a very broad question, but it is a science, and we are struggling, I can tell you. We have tried a lot of different coatings with different results, of course, but we put a lot of focus on it, because for us it's performance, or first of all that the anti-fouling should survive during a docking period. At least 2 or maybe 3 or even 5 years with no fouling. And then we come to the fuel consumption. And it's very important that we have a very smooth surface. So we look on all those 2 factors to sort of judge the product.
When it comes to the actual mixing of the Selektope into a hull coatings product, I guess it's not just a question of taking a pipette and putting a few drops into a can. You've got to assess what the impact of the Selektope is, as well as the other properties of each individual hull coating.
Yes, and I kind of wish it was so easy that we just could drop in a few drops in every paint can when they're basically sitting on the shelf, but that's not the reality, right? We're actually spending with all these paint makers, I don't know, what is it, about 10, 15 years of dialogue, cooperation, and whatever else to try to figure out what's the best measures of
Because different hull coatings have got.
You can see the hull, you see how the coating looks, but you also need to be able to measure it. So we've invested quite heavily in measurement technique, so we can actually get proper results from the trials we do, because without that, you can't really see if it's 5% more or less. We're down to tens of percent now that we can measure over time, so we can actually see if a paint is applied properly. We can compare them very well side to side with sister ships. So right now we're a little bit in the trial and error phase, but I think we've seen a few paints that didn't deliver, and we've seen paints that have definitely delivered. So for us, it's sort of the field is starting to clear a bit, but I think there's a lot more to do still.
At what point does a hull coating become a problem at all, in terms of when it doesn't work? So how Michael mentioned sort of monitoring the measurement of the thickness of any growth on the hull, or the amount of hull coating perhaps that's left there. How do you actually have the right kind of measurement tools and to be able to have that information to respond to it?
Today, I think you can very easily identify even the onset of slime on a vessel, or even slight weak growth, because at least what I see in terms of measurement technology, the monitoring and good data analytics, so you can measure down to very, points of percent performance. We have very good models for correcting for all the factors on draft and wind and current and everything like that. So a really good performance monitoring system allows performance day by day to detect immediately the onset of fouling. I also see some disruptive technologies coming on the sort of underwater drone side, and I think it won't be long from now that each ship will just have a drone that will just drop out into the sea, and it will automatically take a little sniff around, take photos and check that there's no foul or anything like that. That's very easy to do. It will cost nothing. So I think to be able to monitor very closely and take action. But unfortunately, the action today then is to start scrubbing and even necessarily all that good always for the paint system or for the ship roughness. So you have another secondary effect there, which can start costing.
And what about from the port state control aspects? I mentioned New Zealand, but I know in California there are fairly tough regulations now that say you more or less can't do scrub your hull to clean it. Are the port state authorities being a lot generally low? Are they adopting of a vessel to determine its under hull?
Not yet, but I would not be surprised if there would be a certain amount of monitoring. We have sniffers for sulfur. I wouldn't be surprised if certain countries who are very strict on invasive species, like Australia and New Zealand, I think we will find other countries coming as well, that will start doing sampling, pick certain ships and have a look. That I expect will come. This will not come as international regulations initially. This will come as regional regulations.
Well, this is what California and New Zealand.
California, New Zealand, Australia, these kind of countries will drive initially this. But it's on the debate, it's on the agenda already for initial discussions in the IMO. So I would not be surprised if it also developed further in that forum.
Have you found that as well, Michael and Per, with your operations in the tanker fleets perhaps, that you go into port and you've got to be acutely aware of different regional regulations when it comes to the hull coating? Per?
It's not that big of an issue so far, what we've seen, but as been mentioned, it's definitely something that's coming, and it's something that I think is going to be a bigger problem than many people suspect, because we're going to see the hull fouling being, that's actually a bigger way of moving organisms in the ballast water, especially with a little ballast exchange and ballast water treatment systems coming. So once that is in place, and there's a little bit to go there, but anyhow it's overall, it is happening, then the hull is going to be the next big thing. And again, you can sort it out, but if you start fouling, it's not a cheap and simple thing to fix that.
Perhaps you'd like to comment.
Coming back to rules, and we were talking about things on the ship and ballast water, but we all know that we have copper today in our paints, and we also know that we have copper in the seawater today, but at high levels of copper in the water is not good for the species in the water. And one scenario could be that we actually stop ships having copper-based anti-fouling, similar to, for example, in Oslo, where they had a lot of pollutions, and they decided to just stop for diesel cars. So maybe that could be a scenario.
So a ban on use of copper, is that something that you would see happen, Raouf, as well? The stringent regulations on some of the accepted ways of or today's model of using anti-fouling?
I think that, as I said earlier, I don't see regulations getting any looser. They will only tighten. And there are clearly some areas of the world where even copper concentrations have caused concern. Rightly or wrongly, that's for other people to argue. What I do see as challenges going forward is actually the impact of climate change on sea temperatures and on acidification on the pH of the water, which would change the environment within which these antifouling solutions currently work, and therefore may impact their performance going into the future. So regulations will definitely tighten up. Personal view, and it is a personal view, I find myself wondering sometimes whether all the environmental concerns are not as well presented as they should be.
Do you mean they're sort of been ignored a little bit, or taken too lightly?
Not ignored, but I also wonder if there is enough scientific evidence behind the concerns to raise the concern. Yes, there are trends, but we need to deal with hard data as to what is the impact, what's happening, and why, and making sure that if we make a decision to tighten regulation, that we actually look at the whole chain of activities related with that. So it might be that we make some environmental improvement here, but create some
knock-on effect somewhere else.
Effect that we don't see either earlier in the chain or
But isn't there also hull coatings? Well, what I was going to say is it's not just the hull. When we're talking hull coatings, of course, we're not just talking the hull. We could be talking about the seawater inlets. We're talking around the bow thrusters, stern thrusters, around the rudder, and all those sorts of areas. So there's all those niches and little areas that could be harbouring barnacles and other life forms. Is that still being a sort of underrepresented issue then?
I think so. I think you're right that we generally look at the underwater hull and consider it almost broadly two areas, the vertical sides and the flat bottom. But actually the niches are becoming more and more important, particularly with the invasive species consideration from the hull. And today the predominant solution envelope is based around liquid solutions, liquid paint. Tor and Philip mentioned about steels and impregnating, but there are possibly other solutions being developed where we may not look at liquid options but alternatives. And for me, those alternatives, we've got to find solutions for the difficult areas such as the niches in particular, and how we handle those, because whilst we can, with current technology, let's say clean the large areas if cleaning is required, when we get into the niches, the time frame, the cost of cleaning those is out of proportion to the rest of the hull.
Just a question about your product, a very sort of direct question then. Does your product work regardless of the speed of the vessel and where it is? Would it equally work in a niche area and on the hull? Would it work in a warm environment as a cold environment? Would it work when the ship was going faster as well as slower?
As for our product, it doesn't really matter. The governing aspects are more in the control of our customers, i.e. makers who will, and they used to obviously tune their different systems, different areas, so they're very well aware of this and extremely skilled in doing so, right? So I'm not at all concerned that can be done, right? And I think Selektope will be part of a toolbox in which we can drive added performance in all those areas, right? And I think that the future of these things, at least the next foreseeable years, right, will consist of maybe a greater mix of discoveries and the products that are now emerging through the regulatory system, right? So I think a mix of all these will be the future. I think some kind of coating systems may be needed on the niche areas, on the bilge keel and so on, others where water flows are higher.
But wouldn't that also, just use either hair or perhaps Tor here, the hull coating itself, if it was for a specific region, a specific trading pattern, would that then be a limit on what you could do with that ship? After a couple of years you say, right, I want to trade it out of the Atlantic, in the Pacific, out of Singapore. Would that be a limiting factor somewhat then, if you took it from a cold environment to a warm or vice versa? Either one, I think, yeah.
Yes, of course. The temperature of the water There's a big influence of the recipe for the antifouling, yes. So we set the trading pattern for a ship when we order the paint.
That is anything. Oh.
Well, for most ships that actually trade globally, they don't want to be limited by certain coatings and looking for a more universal solution. But I think there's a huge difference between ships that actually do run at fairly high speeds and short turnaround versus vessels that stay in sort of at anchor for maybe 2 and 3 weeks waiting for cargo or new instructions, which quite a lot of ships do. I remember an analysis 2-3 years ago showed that boat carriers, in addition to sort of waiting to get into port and staying in port, spent about, on average, ocean-going boat carriers spent 20% of their time idling. And then if you idle in the wrong place, you certainly have a huge challenge. So I think you have to be selective in terms of your trading areas and be conscious of this, but I have no belief in sort of very dedicated coatings other than for very small niche markets.
Good. Philip, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Ideas on the different angles to hull coatings. I think we can conclude that without hull coatings, the world is going to be a lot worse in terms of emissions and cost of operation. We definitely need sharp, well-functioning hull coatings, and we also think that by introducing biotechnology to this, we're all ready to enhance the whole performance level to yet one more step. I'm not saying that's the end station, because we know that everything is changing. We've been talking about this. Nothing is going to be the same tomorrow as it is today, but it's at least going to take us through what we can see today in terms of trying to reduce the invasive aquatic species issue and keeping fuel bills down, right? And now at least BPR, the European governing regulatory body, has at least gone from what, 40 some substances down to 8 or something in that range, right? So there's not that much to choose from, and I think the combinations and the way that paint makers will combine this will try to respond to the need for more flexibility that ship owners here are asking for. But it's also the fact that the science coming to us from other fields, digitalization, you know, all kind of information flows coming in, will help to actually better specify, hopefully, the appropriate coatings, because there is still a very important factor in how you specify and choose your coating for your ship in question. So there's a lot of good moments, and we are very proud to be part of that solution.
Good. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you. Thank you.